Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Kim Havens. I'm the event manager here at An Unlikely Story in Plainville, Massachusetts. I'm so excited to welcome John Karalis to talk about his new book, The Boston Celtics All-Time All-Stars, the best players at each position for the Cs. Before we get started, I just have a couple technical tips to go over. If you have any issues with your video or audio quality, if you can't hear the event, just try refreshing your page, and then if that doesn't work, just go ahead and close your browser, leave the presentation, and log back in. We do have an Ask a Question box where you can post your questions for John, and he will answer those for you. Also, there's a green button, very perfect that it is green, at the bottom of your screen where you can purchase a copy of the Boston Celtics All-Time All-Stars. And John is in Plainville here with us, and he has graciously agreed to both sign and personalize copies. So when you place the order, just add the name you'd like the book inscribed to in the order comments when you check out. John Karalis has covered the Boston Celtics since 2006. He is a former college and professional basketball player who now covers the Celtics for Boston Sports Journal. John is the host of the Locked On Celtics podcast, the #1 Celtics podcast in the world, and is also one of the hosts of the Locked On NBA podcast. This is his first book, The Boston Celtics All-Time All-Stars. It's a trip through Celtics history to find the 12 best players, 2 at each position and 2 wild cards, to make up the all-time all-star team. Agree with his choices or not, you'll learn all there is to know about the men who played for and coached the most successful franchise in NBA history. To paraphrase John in his intro, his goal is for fans to both have fun with the Celtics' amazing history and to come away with a deeper appreciation of it and its collection of some of the greatest basketball players of all time. So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you John Karalis.
Hey, that was great.
Hey, John.
You want to do that intro again?
Sure.
I was so happy about that. Thank you very much. I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to be talking to everybody. I see people that I know in here. I see some people that I don't, and this is really cool. So a little bit about me. You might see the jerseys over my shoulder. Those are mine. I played at college at Emerson College in Boston, and then I went over to Greece and played a short career before the injuries ended my career very quickly. But it was such a blast. It was so exciting to go over there and play basketball and experience that. And I try to carry those experiences into my coverage today. Now, I spent a lot of time working in television before getting into covering sports full time. And I used to run a blog called redsarmy.com. I started that back in 2006 with my friend Chuck McKinney. The blog took off, various podcasts took off. And I just, once I was covering the team and getting in deep with the team, I knew I had to do it full time. And luckily now I do for Boston Sports Journal. So hopefully people are enjoying my coverage, enjoying the Locked On Celtics podcast, which I do, which is now on YouTube, by the way, just expanding all of the places that the podcast is available. I love talking about basketball. It's my passion. And one of the things that I try to get across in everything that I write, including this book, is that as much as I grew up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and as much as I grew up loving the Boston Celtics, I love basketball more than anything. And basketball has given me everything great in my life. It has taught me lessons that I carry with me to this day. It has given me friendships that still stay strong. Even people who I see Adrian Segura in the chat room over here. Dre and I had a very short time together in college, but we became such close friends through basketball that even in that short time, and even with him living across the country, we're still friends. And that's just unbelievable. And I think only sports can give me some kind of connection like that. But Sports has given me the opportunity to write this book. Basketball has given me the opportunity to make a living sitting here talking, having a microphone to talk to you guys and write and just explore my passion. So my loyalty first and foremost is to the game of basketball and all of the great things that it has given, not just me, but can give everybody, the enjoyment and the passion and really for 2.5 hours a day and however many hours that we talk about it, we really can leave our differences aside and talk about basketball and just enjoy that I can talk basketball with people of all colors, all religions, genders, whatever your identity, it doesn't matter. If you want to talk basketball with me, we can talk. And that's one of my favorite things about the sport and about sports in general. So that's a little bit about me. Like I said, I grew up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and lifelong Rhode Islander, lived in southeastern Massachusetts for a long time, spent some time in New York City, but I'm a New England kid. So this book here is when I was approached to write this book, it was really cool. Lions Press reached out to me and asked me to kind of kick off their series. They have a series of books called the All-Time All-Stars for different teams. And this is their first NBA book. And they approached me and asked me if I wanted to do it. And I jumped at the chance because who doesn't want to write a book? As a person who, talks and writes for a living, this was a really cool project. And the project was really mine to create. Like there was no template for it. So I could have made things easy for me and just made a list of 12 guys and ranked 12 guys or 15 guys or whatever and created the all-star team however I wanted to do it. But I decided to make it a little bit of a challenge because I think some positions in Celtics history are deeper than others. And one of the fun things about an all-star team is the debate over who should make it, but the debate over guys who get left off and why did this guy not make this all-star team? And so I thought this would create some level of that debate while still allowing me to go through and really try to capture the true all-time all-stars at each position. So I formatted it as 2 from each position. That was my choice. And obviously 5 positions in basketball. So I said, I'm going to pick a starter and that person's backup. And then all of the people that I don't pick from those 5 positions go back into the pool, and I get to pick 2 more to basically give 2 wild cards at any position to kind of round out the roster. I picked 12 because that's what an all-star team is. That's how many all-stars there are, as much as I think that there should be an all-star, 15 all-stars. Right now it's 12, so I went with 12. And so one of the things about this book is when you're going through Celtics history, you start to realize like there are a lot of like pretty obvious choices, right? So there's some debate in some spots and not much debate in others. Like obviously when you look at the cover of the book, Larry Bird's going to make the all-time all-star team. Like that's not exactly a debate. But how do you go through and tell the story of a franchise that has so many good players and you say, well, yeah, obviously your choice of Larry Bird as the starting small forward, how do you, so what? So you say, okay, started Larry Bird and that's it. I didn't want that to just be the case. I wanted to dive into the history of these guys and what made them who they are. So one of the things about this book is you get a sense of what drove these players, what turned some of these all-time greats, these no-brainer locks at each position, what turned them into such amazing players. And it becomes a little bit of a history lesson and hopefully a way for you to appreciate each player just a little bit more. You know, some of the Larry Bird in Indiana, the story of him kind of finding a group of guys who worked at a local hotel, because Terre Haute, Indiana is actually a tourist spot, and in that area, and there are hotels there for people to drive through and stay, and the hotel workers were Black, and the Black players were not exactly treated the same as the white players, as we know historically. But Larry Bird, as a young guy, found these guys and said, hey, he didn't care about all of that other stuff. He said, hey, you guys are really good at basketball, because those guys on their break would be playing basketball out in the court near the hotel. And he'd see them playing, and he'd see that they were really good, better than him, and he'd want to hop in and he'd hold his own. And there was no sense of, hey, that's a Black player, I don't want to associate with that. Like, he never had any of that. But that allows him to see the world in a different light at a time in U.S. history where that was not very common. It was very segregated. And the segregation of basketball is another challenge that I faced in writing this book, because a lot of Boston's great history, the majority of their championships, are won in a much different era with a much different style of basketball. And I have to account for the NBA being different in the times of Bob Cousy and Ed Mchale, and even the better players, Casey Jones and Sam Jones and Bill Russell and those guys. And so the things that those guys faced, the adversity that they faced off the court, the Black players, factors into their ability to hold their own on the court. And the best players, and so Bill Russell is another very obvious lock. He's one of the greatest players of all time, just like Larry was, and maybe the greatest defender of all time. He's the ultimate winner. But he played at a time where the Celtics would travel and he would get denied service, and the other Black players would get denied service, especially when they were making their exhibition runs through the South. And that stuff matters in the context of, how does a player who already at that time is making so little that he has to take another job. A lot of these guys had to take second jobs in the offseason to make ends meet. So it's not today's NBA where guys are getting $30 or $40 million contracts. Those guys had to take second jobs in the summers. How does a guy who's not making that much money, who's playing in Chuck Taylor Converse, just basically a piece of canvas sewed to a piece of rubber and some shoelaces, and get out there and play? I can barely walk up the street in my Chuck Taylors. Like, that hurts. How did these guys play entire NBA seasons in those? How does a guy excel to the level that they excelled? And we're talking about some of the greatest players of all time. Sam Jones is maybe one of the most criminally underrated stars in NBA history. His name rarely comes up, but he is one of the most clutch players of all time. People talk about Bill Russell, but they don't add in the context of civil rights strife and his home being vandalized with racist graffiti and worse. That stuff is hard to separate. And we see that brings us to, I think, today's players and the Black Lives Matter movement and that kind of stuff, where you can see it has an impact on them. And it's hard to go out there and play a game and focus on that game when everything else around you is swirling the way it was. So that does matter. I have to figure out how much of that goes into figuring into, where does Casey Jones fit in the hierarchy of guards? And then before a lot of the Black players came in, we know that the Black players were kept separate in a lot of guys went to the Harlem Globetrotters. Bill Russell was almost a member of the Harlem Globetrotters. There were other leagues that they went to, and the white players were in the NBA. And so the level of competition was not the same. The best players in the world were not playing in the league at that time. So you have to look at the Frank Ramseys and Ed Mchales and those guys, and you say, okay, they played extraordinarily well. And that was the time that they were alive. So you don't want to take too much away from them. But if you're looking to break ties in point guard and shooting guard and small forward, and a guy that a more contemporary player is somebody that you might wait a little bit more than one of the former players. It's a balance. And those are all of the things that I was considering. So when you look at the point guard, for example, now Bob Cousy is one of the original Celtics. So he had that NBA that wasn't quite as competitive. So what raises Bob Cousy above other point guards? Well, Bob Cousy was an innovator. Bob Cousy was the first showman of his time. And when you see and read and hear the stories about Bob Cousy, is that he was so outrageously better in doing things that no one has ever seen before, and doing things that were so creative that the league didn't know how to handle it. That stuff was a deciding factor. So yeah, shocker, spoiler alert, Bob Cousy is my first choice for point guard in Celtics, of the Celtics all-time all-stars. But he changed things in such a way that it's hard to ignore how much of an impact that he had. Now, Bob Cousy was also heavily involved in the players union and making sure that these guys were compensated and treated fairly. And he was one of the early innovators of the Basketball Players Association. So, you know, his impact on the entire league is bigger than just the dribbling. And then you do focus, like I focused on the dribbling and the criticisms that people say, because he had a very exaggerated, like, hand on top of the ball dribble. And people say, well, you'd never be able to dribble like that in today's NBA. But by contrast, and I wrote this in the book, Kyrie Irving, who's the best ball handler in the NBA right now, would never be able to exist in his current form in that NBA, because the NBA allows somebody to dribble with the hand on the side of the ball. The second he did that, he'd get called for a carry in that era, and it'd be a turnover. So that is a way to kind of differentiate things too. Bob Cousy, the ball handler back then, when you say his ball handling, yeah, it was good for back then, but it would never fly now, be like, well, the rules would be different now. And when I compare eras, I try to not do what is commonly done, where you just take a player and transport them into today's game. I take that player and I say, if that player was born the same time today's players were born, what advantages would he have? What would he be able to do? And what rules changes would he have that would allow him to play? So a guy like Bob Cousy, I know that he's one of the best ball handlers, the best ball handler, the best absolute ball handler of that era. So what would happen if you took the best ball handler of that era and you gave him today's rules, today's diet, today's training, today's everything, and said, go? Well, I feel like he would adapt to today's rules pretty well, and he'd be dribbling a lot like Kyrie is dribbling. He'd have his hand on the side of the ball, and he'd be able to make those inside-out dribbles like that weren't allowed back then. And the assist rules were different. His numbers would be different. And that's another thing that you have to consider. The assist rules were much more stringent back then. So when I'm comparing the actual stats, which is something that people always do, and I did in this book, I take their statistics, but there's a difficulty in that, because looking at Bob Cousy's statistics, he averaged, I forget what the exact number is, but when he averaged however many assists it was, that pass had to directly lead to a basket. In today's NBA, as long as the first thing a player does when he catches the ball is make a move towards the basket, even if he takes 2 dribbles and scores, that's still an assist in today's NBA. That would not have been an assist in Bob Cousy's era. So knowing that, I have to take that into account. Another thing I have to take into account is the shooting percentages back then were abysmal. The best shooters in the league shot in the low 40% range, which is what the worst shooters in the league right now shoot. Marcus Smart is criticized heavily for his shooting percentage. Back then, he'd be one of the best shooters in the league. You got to look at why. Why are these things happening when you're comparing the eras and you're trying to compile a list of the all-time all-stars? Well, they didn't have nuanced offenses. There weren't pick and rolls. There weren't all of these, flex offenses and, motions and high dribble handoffs and all that stuff. It was basically just put up as many shots as you can. The first guy that had a decent look was putting that shot up. And we didn't have a whole long history of shooting technique to learn and practice. And it was ugly. The numbers were ugly. And that's not coincidentally, I should say, why the rebounding numbers were so great. Bill Russell averaged like 50 rebounds. Will Chamberlain averaged 50 rebounds. How does one guy like that average 50 rebounds? Well, they're putting up 120, 130, and 140 shots. By percentage, the biggest guy on the floor is going to get that. And they had more defined roles back then. So that is a factor in how do I compare these eras? Because a guy who had a ton of rebounds back then, you say, wow, this guy averaged 20-something rebounds. Like, yeah, but that's kind of like averaging 10 or 11 today. So how much am I going to penalize a Kevin Mchale, Robert Parrish, or one of these guys? I'm naming the obvious guys because I don't want to give away all of the players that I've put in the book. But that type of stuff goes into the choices that I've made with the book. Now, I will say I did take one liberty with one of the positions. And because I made the rules, I got to do that. So I won't give it away, but this was a way for me to not have to put Paul Pierce in a wild card. So I took a liberty with Paul Pierce. I'll just admit that, hands up. I did that, but it worked. All right. And you'll see when you get into the shooting guard, small forward section, the liberty that I took that allowed me to work Paul Pierce into the top 10 and not the wild card. And that opened things up to make sure that I got a couple of choices in there for the wild card. Now, I will say, I'll give you my number one guy that I left off before we open things up to questions, because I see I've only got about 5 or 6 minutes left here in my presentation portion. When I came into this, I was 100% sure, would have put money on it, that I was going to have Dennis Johnson as one of my point guards. Like, that was a lock, done deal. And then you dive into things, and DJ did great things in Boston. And he's one, as a guy that grew up with 80s Celtics, that was a huge, it's funny. I'm laughing here because my buddy Ken just made a comment about me leaving DJ off. Ken, I'll get to you. I'll finish this. I'll finish this thought. Ken and I were teammates at Emerson. Let me preface it by saying this. When I was growing up, I was, like I said, I was born in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, but my parents are immigrant Greeks. And so they came to this country in like 1972, and I was born a year later. And so growing up in the 70s, I didn't have the memories of some people growing up in the 70s, sitting on a couch with their their dad or mom and watching a basketball game or being taken to the Garden as a kid and having that early kind of deep imprint that says, oh God, I'll never forget the smell of section 10 with the guy with the stogie and all that. Like, I don't have that memory. My first memory of the Celtics was as a 11 or 12-year-old watching the Celtics on national TV, Larry Bird era. And all I kept seeing was guys making shots. And I couldn't understand at that point how anybody won the game, because I just kept seeing the ball go in. I was like, how does anybody win this game if everybody's making the shots? So I grew up on that era of basketball, like DJ, the steal by Bird, all of that stuff. That's my earliest imprint of Celtics basketball and NBA basketball. So I thought DJ was absolutely a lock to make it. But then you get into more of his history, and not just of his history, but the other point guards that have played for the Celtics. And you have things like, how long did you play for the Celtics? This is the Boston Celtics all-time all-stars. And Dennis Johnson came to Boston on the tail end of his career, like post-peak, not at the end, but he was a champion. He was already an MVP. He played in Seattle. He played in Phoenix. Now, he was a malcontent. He had a bad reputation, and that's how the Celtics ended up getting a really good player. But by the time he got to Boston, he was playing a supporting role. But I loved that supporting role. And putting this list together, taking that emotion out of it, and I saw some of the other point guards, and I have already put Bob Cousy on there. There are other guys who are just as accomplished as Celtics and more. And so the more I dove into it, the more I saw the impact, the more I saw how certain guys made contributions to Celtics history, the more I was like, oh my God, I can't pick Dennis Johnson. And so I leave him off my point guard list, and then I get to the wild card list. I was like, oh my God, I might have to leave Dennis Johnson off this again. So if you want to know the most painful part of the book, it's that I couldn't put Dennis Johnson in there. And I hope that as you read this, the absolute anguish that I felt writing that comes through, because it still hurts. Like, I'm feeling like, oh God, I can't believe I have to admit this, but I feel like, oh man. And one of the more fun things, just to wrap this up, are the guys that, first of all, I do coaches as well. So Red Auerbach is a coach, but there's a little fun twist with the wild cards and the coaching section. And some of the guys I wish I could have put them in there, were a lot of fun. Because one of the guys I had to highlight in here was Togo Palazzi, who, first of all, the name Togo Palazzi is just an amazing name to say. Everybody should just say the name Togo Palazzi once a day. And whatever you're like, whenever you're feeling at your most down, just say Togo Palazzi, and you're just going to smile. It's guaranteed. Togo played he was one of the original Celtics, played 1954 to 1957. The reason why I put Togo in this book is because his son Matt played for Providence College. And when I was growing up in Pawtucket, I went to the Providence College camps. And then after I was in college, I went back in the summers to work as a counselor at the Providence College basketball camps. And Togo was there. And when I was there as a player, as a high school player, one of the pieces of advice that he gave us was, if you're in the post, if you're a post player, before the game, eat a big thing of garlic. So when you get into the post, you turn around and go, and the guy will back right off of you. That's why Togo Palazzi is in this book. And with that, I will end my presentation almost exactly 30 minutes. So that's my internal TV timing. Thank you guys for listening.
That's
And
pretty funny. We don't
this
have any
is,
other programming after you, John, so you're you're all good.
I just want to open it up to the questions here. But no Ken LaFlamme. Ken LaFlamme does not get to ask any questions. In fact, is there a way for me to boot him? Because no, it's all right. Fine. Ken, you stay.
We can,
what do we got for
we
questions?
can invite him on the screen and he can ask his question in person.
Oh, no, I don't want to see his face.
Okay. So Dorian, number one question is from Dorian, who would like to know, what is your favorite memory throughout your time covering the Celtics?
Favorite memory? I don't have a particular one that sticks out as like because when you're covering the team, it's you get caught up in these moments. So I will tell you this. Here's the favorite thing that I get to do is now not this year because of COVID, and this kind of qualifies as my favorite memory. When the game is over and I've written all the stuff that I've got to write. So on a 7:30 games typically take 2.5 hours. So that's 10 p.m. By the time the post-game interviews are done and we're back and we finish logging all of the interviews, it's past 11. By the time I finish writing, that's another hour and a half or so. So we're getting into 12:30, 1 a.m. time. When I get to leave an arena really early in the morning and they haven't taken the floor off if there's no Bruins game, I get to walk out there. They change the lighting. They shut down all of the event lighting. There's like a little yellowish light there's a tinge there. It's kind of sort of dusky in there. And I get to go and stand on the court and look up and look around at all the empty seats. And it's my absolute favorite thing. I mean, I'll do it every chance I get. And every chance I get, it just is the most awesome feeling because this court is the same size. I played on a court that was that size. It was just in a little dingy place, and they built this big arena with this court with all of these seats so people can watch this game that I love and watch the best people play this game. That's so awesome. That's given me all this stuff. And just standing there and feeling like a part of it, I still feel the energy of that building. So any of my favorite memories as I work covering the team involve, and this doesn't have to even be the Garden. Do it in Milwaukee, do it in Houston. Any chance I get to walk out onto the empty floor at the end of my day and just see this nice big place with that floor in the middle, it fills my heart. It's awesome.
That is very cool. So Adrian, you may have already answered this question, but maybe you'll have a second challenging. Sure. What was your most significant challenge in writing this book?
The real answer is getting it done on time. I think that's every author's answer, right? It really was trying to figure out how to tell the story of these main guys, because like I said before, Bill Russell's going to make it. Larry Bird's going to make it. Kevin Mchale and John Havlicek, they're going to make it. So it was not. It was me trying to find a way to say, okay, Bill Russell made it, and we know Bill Russell's going to be the starting center, but here are a whole lot of reasons why Bill Russell became the Bill Russell that he is, and that's why he became the starting center. So it was the challenge of telling their story and explaining what exactly it was that made them so great. Like John Havlicek had bigger than normal lungs, and he actually could run longer because he had more capacity to breathe and get the air into his body. And so he could just run forever, like that type of stuff, those little things. The Casey Jones and how he was such a tenacious defender and how that was born from him getting a football tryout. And if you watch the NFL and there's bump and run coverage, Casey Jones invented bump and run coverage when he was trying out for, was it the Cleveland Browns or I forget which team it was, but he would jam receivers because he saw in the rule books, and this is how smart he was. He read the rule books and he says, oh yeah, I can jam this guy and get up into him until the ball's in the air or until he catches it. And everybody complained about the rules, and they're like, no, actually you can do that. And he created an entirely different form of NFL defense before he became one of the best defensive players in Celtics history. So those types of things, and finding those and properly telling that story was to justify the choices that I made was one of the biggest challenges.
I would guess that would be. So Christine wanted to know if this is being recorded, and she also says, John, you are awesome, which I can say, great.
Thank
you. So yes, is. So if you decide to give the book to someone, they can come back and watch this anytime using the same link. And to just remind everyone, click the link at the bottom, and John, we are going to arrange when he's going to come in and sign books.
Yeah.
So that's going to be amazing. So Christine also had a comment that I'm not sure if it was a question, but maybe you'll know what she's talking about. She says 1986 versus Hawks.
Yeah. The 1986, you're talking about like Larry Bird and the Dominique Wilkins duel. That was, or if we're talking about, this was a game, I forget what Larry Bird scored in that game. It was 60 or whatever it was. But it was a back and forth duel against the Hawks where they were playing in New Orleans. So back then, every team would have like another venue that they played in. And so you might remember the Celtics had games at the Hartford Civic Center. They'd play 2 games a year at the Hartford Civic Center for a long stretch. They were playing this game in New Orleans, so it wasn't the typical Celtics-Hawks backdrop. And Larry Bird and Dominique Wilkins were engaged in such a duel, but Larry Bird started hitting shots that the Atlanta Hawks guys on the bench were celebrating. And I think Mike Fratello was the coach at the time, and he said, like, internally he was doing the same thing, but he was so mad at his guys because Larry Bird hit a shot, and those guys were like, oh my God, falling over themselves on the bench. And he'd look over, and I had to fine half my team, but they were also right because he was hitting some of the most ridiculous shots that he'd ever seen. I think that would be the reference, right?
I believe so. Yeah, I know what you mean about you just like, how are they going to win? How are they going to play this game? Everyone's just getting their, balls just go back and forth in the basket.
The talent level in the 1980s, the NBA was smaller. So, they hadn't expanded. So that's why, there's a great photo of the jump ball between the Celtics and the Lakers where, there's 10 guys on the floor, and I think there are 8 Hall of Famers that are, and it wasn't quite the 1960s where there were, 8 teams and 10 teams and every team was pretty loaded, but every team in the 80s had an opportunity to have like 3 or 4 really, really good players. So with such high level talent, it was hard to stop anybody. So I understand now, thinking back about how I used to perceive the game. I can understand why I was like, oh yeah, how does anybody miss? Because it didn't feel like they ever did.
That was cracking me up in the intro. So Barbara has a question. She says, as the game has evolved, what changes do you like and which ones do you not? So I do like the offense to a degree. I like that there's an added skill of shooting, and these guys are shooting from 30 and 35 feet. I mean, that is amazing. And shots that when I was younger and playing that I can't imagine any coach, like, hell, Ken will tell you if I took any of those shots, I would have been benched for a week. But the fact that it's opened up the game to a different level of player, and that so many guys need to be able to do so many things, that's great. But now what I would like to see is some level of adjustment where the game isn't quite as homogenous, where in the
in the earlier days, if you had, depending on the certain players, like if you had big players, you were a post-up team. And if you had shooters, you were an outside team. And nowadays, everybody's trying to play kind of the exact same way, just little variations, but you're all trying to get the same exact shots. You're all trying to get the layups, dunks, three-point shots, and it's never more highlighted in anything more like the fast break, when it's like a 3-on-1, and it drives me absolutely nuts when I see a 3-on-1 fast break and the two guys on the non-ball handlers flare out to the corner for three. And I get it. It's a corner three. The numbers support like a wide open corner three. That's a shot that you want. But I'm always like, fill the lane, get the layup. That little nuance there of today's game versus the other. I want to make it so we're more geared towards creativity in building a team and not having to find all the same players, because every team's looking for the exact same kind of guy. Instead of saying, okay, we've got this guy, he's really good at this, we're gonna build around this guy's skills, instead of trying to find the best guy who has this type of skills that the entire league is trying to get. And the other thing that I would love to see go away is the foul grifting, the Trae Young, the flopping. Instead of the James Harden, instead of trying to get baskets, they're making plays specifically designed to get free throws. And I hate that. That's the number one thing that I hate. I want that to go away somehow. And that's rules. A lot of these changes in the NBA have to do with the rules changes. And so making it so a guy who initiates the contact doesn't actually get rewarded with a call can actually help the flow of the game. And the last thing I'll say is I do believe in replay. I want to make sure we get the calls right, but we got to find a way to straighten that out. And I think the way to straighten that out is don't give the call to the guys on the floor. Whenever there should be somebody assigned to be constantly reviewing the game. And when there's a challenge or when there's a review, have that official either be in the arena or in headquarters, having already started the process and be in communication with these guys to speed this up. So by the time they get together and huddle and talk to the coaches and get to the monitor, then they start the whole thing. No, all of that time when they're huddling and talking and all that stuff, someone else is already reviewing. So when they put that thing on, they say, here's what I see. I see it went off of this guy. Here's the replay that shows it. They go, yep, I see that. Boom, done. So you get the replay. It's done. It's over. Baseball kind of does it that way. I want it to be more of that than the current system.
All right. And we'll close out with a question from your pal, Ken. Larry Bird aside, which player's game translates best across all the eras?
So you'd need somebody who can, you need somebody who's good at all of the different things. There are a lot of good choices, guys who could, like Kevin Mchale could be great. He would be great in the earlier eras because he's tall and he wasn't exactly like shredded, huge. So back in the earlier days when everybody was skinny, he'd still look the exact same. So he'd probably dominate the earlier eras. Obviously, he was dominant in the 80s. And I think we saw at the end of his career that he started to pop out and extend his range. So he would be a stretch 4, stretch 5 in today's NBA while still being one of the best defenders around. So, it's easy to say like a Paul Pierce because these dynamic wings can translate all over the place. Like you could take any of these, a guy who can pass, dribble, and shoot. And yeah, of course, if you can do that, you can do that anywhere. But I think Kevin Mchale would be absolutely dominant across the eras. And I think his game would evolve into today's era pretty nicely. I actually kind of wish I could see Kevin Mchale as a stretch five in today's era. Because man, you could run pick and roll with him. He could pop out. He's very willing to take those threes. And as an added bonus, he's kind of like a funny guy. So those appearances that he had on Cheers, like, can you imagine Kevin Mchale with Instagram? Like, total package. So yeah, I'm going to go with Kevin Mchale.
Forget about that. Oh my gosh.
Oh my God.
Awesome.
Kevin Mchale was like one of the most gregarious guys around. So like, I think he'd be especially perfectly fitted for this era. Give him
Absolutely.
a cell phone cam. Like, oh my God.
Oh man. Yeah. Now you got me on that topic. So anyways, John, thank you. Who would I want to see on social media? That would be a question.
I know. Not Larry Bird. That's for sure.
No.
He would never, ever, ever be on social media. I can see him, even if he was born today, like as a teenager, he'd be like, nah, it doesn't matter.
Oh, that's hilarious. Oh my God. This has been so much fun, John. So I just want to encourage everyone, get your copy, click on the green button below. Perfect gift for Father's Day, grads. And John will be coming in the store and signing and personalizing. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, John. This has been a blast.
Thank you.
We look
so
forward
much.
to seeing you in the store.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to coming in. Thank you, everybody. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks, John.